Welcome to Antitrust Code by Concurrences. Concurrences is the leading antitrust database with over 30,000 articles on competition law. Concurrences is also the largest network of antitrust experts with lawyers, economists, enforcers, and academics in 85 countries. By listening to this podcast, you will learn the fundamentals of competition law and hear about the latest antitrust news thanks to our guests, the best experts in the antitrust world.
So hello, I am Ori Schwartz. I'm the head of the competition division in the OECD. And we are recording this podcast to celebrate the publication of a new book, Compendium on International Cartels, which was published a few months ago by Concurrences, is a collection of papers authored by different team members of the OECD competition division throughout the last decade or so, and are focused on cartels. The book covers traditional topics such as leniency programs and ex officio investigations, as well as more novel areas like algorithmic collusion and cutting-edge detection tools. It covers matters of substance like bid rigging in public procurement and procedures such as the standard of review in competition cases. One of the chapters in the book is focused on international cooperation in competition enforcement, which brings me to the topic of our conversation today. But please let me start by introducing our guest, Juliette. Juliette Enser is the Executive Director for Competition Enforcement at the Competition and Markets Authority, the UK CMA. Juliette is a member of the CMA board and its senior executive team. Since February 2024, she has been responsible for the CMA's competition enforcement function with the aim of tackling unlawful and damaging anti-competitive conduct for the benefit of people, businesses, and the wider economy. Previous career highlights include Senior Director for Cartels at the CMA, Senior Director for State Aid at the CMA, and a lawyer in private practice. Hello, Juliette, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello, Ori. Thank you very much for inviting me onto this podcast.
Great, so let's dive right into it. So even though the topic of our conversation will be focused mostly on international cooperation, let me take advantage of the fact that you're here and you have such a vast knowledge of cartel enforcement, and just ask you kind of generally, what are the recent trends that you see with cartel enforcement?
So I think one of the trends that has really marked the last few years has been the growing interest internationally in what you might call proactive detection of cartels. And by that, really, I mean any form of cartel detection that doesn't result from a leniency application. And I think this trend really perhaps originated in partial response in at least some jurisdictions to a drop off in leniency applications. But taking it back to its roots, ultimately, it's really important that competition authorities are able to detect cartels without leniency, partly, of course, to drive leniency applications. So I think from a UK perspective, we've really thought of proactive detection as an important facet of our work for some time now. But it's been great to be able to participate in some of the international discussions about this and watch the really intense know-how sharing that's been going on between agencies in this field. And that's, there's been some really exciting developments, obviously. You've referred to cutting edge detection tools. And we've seen a lot of interest in, as data analytics improve, as the sheer quantity of data available improves. There's a real excitement, I'd say, about the possibility of some of these tools of really being quite transformative when it comes to cartel detection.
If I may jump in here, I mean, we hear about that again, the opportunities that this new tools brings along with them, but also about the risks, because competition authorities are not the only one using this very novel and sophisticated tools. So where are we there? Are we in a good point in terms of the balance between the capabilities that cartelists have and authorities?
Oh, that is a really good question. As you say, we upskill ourselves, but so do those who might profit through unlawful behavior. I think, look, the sense I get at the moment is that the competition authorities are doing pretty well. I would say that in terms of, you've seen a lot of investment, I would have said, by authorities recently in their technical capabilities, both on the data side, but also more broadly in terms of how we collect, how we handle evidence. So I think, that clearly there's always work to be done there, but I would say that we're in a relatively good place there.
Great. So let's move now to the main topic of our conversation, which is international cooperation in cartel enforcement. I would start by saying that the OECD has been doing a lot of work on the international cooperation for many years, with the OECD recommendation on international cooperation in competition enforcement as the most prominent example. The recommendation, which is basically an international best practice adopted by all OECD member countries, is from 2014, but an earlier version goes back to the 1960s. So, Juliette, where does international cooperation in cartel enforcement stand at the moment?
Well, my knowledge of international cooperation in cartel enforcement, I'm pleased to say, does not go back to the 60s, but it does go back a frighteningly long time. And when I think about, the work that I've been doing in cartel enforcement over the years, I am struck by just the depth and breadth of cooperation that now exists. And, I think this is probably, I can really see it partly because of the situation that we found ourselves in the UK following Brexit, where a greater proportion of our cases than are international than was previously the case, because obviously we're now able to investigate the cases that previously fell within the Commission's exclusive jurisdiction, those cross-border cases. So, we've really had to focus a lot on international cooperation. And I think three things have struck me from that experience. The first is how broad cooperation is between agencies. So I think when people think about international cooperation, they tend to focus on cooperation within cases. But actually, the cooperation extends far beyond that. It extends both into exchange of best practices. I was talking about the proliferation of sort of exchanges around proactive detection. That's one example, but there are many others. It also extends, for example, to discussions of lead generation, and so very much beyond just the cases. Secondly, is the importance of building trust and confidence. So agencies, I think, tend to participate in a number of there are a number of ways that agencies talk to each other, including, for example, through the OECD. And those kind of conversations can really help support the building of trust and confidence and really mutual understanding of each other's regimes. And that becomes critically important when agencies are working on cases together. And then I suppose the other thing is really the importance of international know-how sharing, because cartel enforcement does involve some fairly unique challenges is when it comes to sort of the type of conduct that we're enforcing against. So, for example, it involves multi-party investigations. It involves typically hidden conduct. It can involve fairly complex fact patterns, communications patterns. So actually being able to learn from other people doing the same thing is really important. But that doesn't mean I don't think that we should only learn from each other, but it does mean that learning from each other is important.
You put a lot of emphasis, if I may, in your reply on the kind of the informal type of cooperation. So this, as you were saying, the relationship-based, a trust-based relationship that you manage to create with peers around the globe, and which brings me perhaps to ask whether you think this is where the potential should be. So are you exactly where you think you should be in terms of international cooperation, or are there further steps that you should take, some room for improvement, perhaps on the more formal side of cooperation?
I suppose I was emphasizing those bits because I think they're sometimes the bits that get, less of a spotlight, if you like, that can go a bit under the radar. But in terms of more formal cooperation, certainly that can be incredibly useful, particularly when it comes, for example, to obtaining evidence that may be located outside the jurisdiction. And in the UK, we've recently passed legislation which should make it easier for us to cooperate with other authorities when it comes to providing investigative assistance, and also in respect of sharing information. And that legislation obviously takes effect in the context of the sort of broader framework of cooperation agreements, of memorandum of understanding. That architecture, I think, is important, particularly, as I say, when it comes to exchanges of information or when obtaining evidence from abroad. That said, is important, but equally, there are, even when it comes to obtaining evidence, it's not always necessary, even in an international case, to rely on those kind of cooperation mechanisms. I mean, in many cases where there are leniency applicants, then it's possible to exchange information by means of waivers. Also, at least in the UK, we do have powers to allow us to obtain information from companies, even where that information may happen to be held in the company's headquarters outside the UK.
You mentioned the MOUs, and you recently signed an MOU with the European Commission, and I think it seems from the press releases, at least that I read, that both parties saw it as a major step forward. So, of course, to the extent that you can share with us, do you see already the fruits, or reaping the fruits of this agreement? Will we see any joint investigations anytime soon?
Well, that agreement is actually an agreement signed by the UK government, rather than the CMA. So it's between the UK and the EU, and it is subject to formal procedures for conclusion. So it's not yet in effect, but that certainly hasn't stopped us from working with our peers in the EU. So I think a number of our investigations since Brexit have been carried out in cooperation or in consultation with the EC. Most recently, we announced a settlement on the same day as the EC in our case related to vehicle recycling, for example, which in fact we also opened the same day as the EC. So the agreement is obviously a good step forward, but even without it, we have been managing to work with our EC counterparts.
Right. So, but there's a very positive note. Let me conclude here, and thank you very, very much for joining us today. It was a very interesting conversation, and hopefully, we can all wish for more international cooperation in competition enforcement. Thank you very much, Juliette.
Thank you. Thank you, Ori.
You listened to an episode of Antitrust Code by Concurrences. If you want to read more about this topic, check the Concurrences website where you can find all relevant articles. Follow us on Twitter @CompetitionLaws and join the Concurrences group on LinkedIn to receive updates on our next podcast.